So throughout the 1970s, Americans are getting fed up with traditional means of authority. A lot of Americans are looking at the changes in society, the rise in crime, the decrease in family values, cults, that type of thing, and they're saying there's something wrong with the United States. Something needs to change. Well, in the middle of the 1970s, the president was the guy we talked about before, Gerald Ford, a guy who had gotten into office not through being elected, but being appointed after one corrupt VP had to leave office, and then the corrupt president had to leave office, and he replaced him. So Americans aren't generally high on Ford. This is a guy that's seemingly part of the problem. Again, I would argue that Gerald Ford's a good person, but he's definitely in the American public doesn't see him that way, especially after he pardons Nixon of potential charges in Watergate. Well, Ford is going to decide to run for president in 1976 to earn his own presidency. So again, he took over for Nixon. He's going to try to run, and the Republicans will have to decide whether or not to make him their candidate for president in 1976. Thing is, Ford is going to have competition from this new upstart in the Republican Party, a guy named Ronald Reagan. Reagan will run against Ford in the primary based on the idea that Ford's not going to win because the American public doesn't trust him. And we're going to talk about in a little bit here. He starts trying to introduce some new ideas to the Republican Party to unseat Ford. He's not able to, but he does mount a substantial challenge to Ford in 1976, which is incredibly rare for an incumbent president to almost be unseated in the primaries of their election. But it almost happens here. The Republicans almost appoint Ronald Reagan as their candidate instead of Ford, but it doesn't turn out that way. Instead, Ford will be nominated as Republican Party candidate, and he's going to be running against this guy right here. His name's Jimmy Carter. He will be the Democratic Party candidate in 1976. Now, the thing is, the Democratic Party is going to put up Jimmy Carter not because he has a particularly vibrant career, not because he has this personality that's going to shine through. Basically, you're going to put up Jimmy Carter because he's an incredibly good dude. And in the 1970s, when everybody in government is looking bad for one reason or another, Americans want a good dude. And so the Democrats are going to say, we have a good person. Jimmy Carter, he's born in Georgia. He was a peanut farmer. His family, they weren't poor, they owned a lot of land. They had a lot of employees. He grew up near black families, poor white families, and so he knew a lot of the strife. He himself wasn't particularly poor, but it's not like they were super well off or anything. But as a young man, Jimmy Carter is going to become an incredibly faithful Christian. He'll later on join the U.S. Navy, and he's going to become a founding, I shouldn't say founding, he's going to become an early member of the United States nuclear submarine program. So he's got two things that if people have these qualities, they're really awesome. Being raised in Georgia and then having served on board a nuclear submarine, those people are awesome. Anybody with those two things, we should just all defer to them. I have those two things. Anyway, so Jimmy Carter, very good dude. He ends up serving as governor for Georgia. He serves as state senator for Georgia. Then he goes on to serve as governor. And he's going to be elected to governor of Georgia in spite of the fact that while a state senator, he was against segregation. He was one of the Democrats that thought our party needs to move on beyond that. He was a New Deal Democrat that said we need to reach out, help African Americans, and he had been, a supporter of desegregation. So he gets into the governor's office, and he's going to do a very good job as governor of Georgia. So much so that this, coupled with the fact that at this point he is a preacher, he basically he ordained minister. You add to that, this is a good guy, great background. They put him up in 1976. And again, they're going to be running against Gerald Ford, this guy who almost lost the Republican Party primary, a guy who the American public views as corrupt for having pardoned Nixon. It looks like Jimmy Carter's just going to cruise into the presidency in 1976. Again, Americans looking for a good dude, and Jimmy Carter's a good dude. Unfortunately, Jimmy Carter, he does know how to stick his foot in his mouth. Like, he'll admit to personal faults when Americans don't necessarily like that. Like, he'll say, truthful stuff like, yes, I sometimes think about women other than my wife. Yes, I, have impure thoughts. He'll have this brother that's sort of comically Georgian. He'll be not the best person in front of the camera. As a matter of fact, a series of television debates, Gerald Ford is going to outperform him in all of them. And Jimmy Carter will almost lose the 1976 presidential election, but he's going to end up emerging victorious. He even wins back the South. Again, as we mentioned, the Democrats had become increasingly dispopular because of their desegregation policies. Well, Jimmy Carter, because he's from the South, is going to get them back. Again, the 60s and 70s are this weird time where you see this flip-flopping, particularly in the South, between these various parties. But again, Jimmy Carter will end up winning the popular vote barely, and is going to win the electoral vote barely as well. Well, he takes over, and poor Jimmy Carter, there's not going to be much to say about his presidency, except for he's not going to be the best president. The one thing he's going to do, and you could look at this as a move of decolonization, he's going to promise Panama that the United States will leave, give them possession of the Panamanian Canal in a couple years. One thing that is going to be bad is the U.S. Embassy in Iran. The United States has supported this coup in 1953 along with Britain, put in place a Shah. A lot of the Iranian people didn't like the Shah, some as deporting the wealth, oil of Iran to the West. And there's going to be this general uprising, and these Iranian revolutionaries will take over the U.S. Embassy, keep them as hostages. Jimmy Carter tries to negotiate to get the hostages out of Iran, but is unsuccessful in doing so. Probably the biggest mistake in Jimmy Carter's presidency is that he sees the problems that are happening in the United States, economic problems, the oil crisis, and he's going to basically tell the United States, you guys need to get your stuff together, okay? We're demanding too much. We need to sacrifice, okay? We need to consume less. We Americans have basically turned towards consumption instead of spirituality, and he's going to start pushing against Americans for using too much oil. Like, perhaps the answer isn't that we need to find a way to get more oil in here, but to drive less. And he calls this, truthfully, what the United States is happening, a crisis of confidence. So we don't trust anybody here in the United States, and he's going to say part of the answer, at least, is to look inward and to consume less. Americans don't like to hear that stuff. Americans want to hear, give us more stuff, kick ass, and Jimmy Carter doesn't say that. So this is going to be unfortunate for him in 1980 when he's going to be up against this, it's hard to say up-and-coming president, or up-and-coming person in the Republican Party, this Ronald Reagan, because it's not like the guy's young. And as a matter of fact, the Republicans will choose Ronald Reagan as their candidate in the 1980 election to run against Jimmy Carter. He, if elected, would be the oldest person to serve in the presidency at that point. But the thing is, Reagan is going to run in and receive the Republican nomination and run against Jimmy Carter, not on a platform of we need to sacrifice, we need to conserve, we need to turn inward, we need to end our consumerism, but instead he's going to run on, we have gone through a tough time. We've gone through moral decay, and this is the fault of big government. This is not your fault, Americans. This is the fault of the way things have been done these past couple decades, and I'm here to change things. So the Republicans, and their candidate will be Ronald Reagan, and he's going to run on a lot of the standards you would hear from the Republican Party. Again, some of these things you'd heard for a long time, some of these things that Reagan will introduce for the first time. One thing he's going to run on is business. Again, he's going to say, business will help the United States. We've seen businesses leave the U.S. We've seen industry leave. I'm going to support business and business growth. And then when businesses get better, the average American life will improve. And he's going to push this idea that will later be called trickle-down economics. He's going to say that if we support the big businesses, then they will create these businesses and profit. They'll start earning profits, and this profit will eventually trickle down to workers. So if we help the wealthy create businesses and form businesses, then when they start making money, they're going to start hiring more people, increasing wages. So the answer is through business, okay? And he's going to say in his campaign against Jimmy Carter in 1980, the answer is not small or not bigger government. And he's going to point to what happened in the 1970s, and he's going to say this is a result of big government. He's going to point to, again, increased crime, this type of thing, and he's going to blame it on Johnson's Great Society. Again, not a whole lot of foundation necessarily, but he's going to say this is the reason that we're seeing increased crime, that type of thing. Government isn't the answer to your problems. He will say business, your neighbors, that type of thing, but it's not big government. He's going to actually say we need to start cutting a lot of these government programs. We need to cut things like Social Security has been going to provide welfare to families that can't work. We need to cut some of those benefits. We need to cut out some of this stuff like Job Corps that Johnson had been put up as part of his Great Society. We need to get reduced money to the Environmental Protection Agency. That was put in place by a fellow Republican, but that's hurting business. We need to do that, get rid of that. And he's going to look at these various government programs that have been put in place and say, this isn't the answer. This is what results in this and happened in the 70s. And as a part of this, he's going to say if there is government, it's better to be at the state level than the national level. So under Johnson, and this had happened really since FDR, and you can even argue before that, you've seen the national government take increased power. Well, Reagan is going to argue that the national government can't properly deal with local issues, and he's going to say instead we should have the state governments be the ones to handle more local problems. They should be the ones to address social issues, not the national government. Now, it's interesting he's saying this because there is definitely a valid argument to this, but he's going to use states' rights, and this is going to be a sort of trigger word or a word that he's specifically aiming at discontented Democrats who don't like the national government stepping in and pushing for integration and desegregation. And a lot of the rallying cry against Civil Rights Act, that type of thing, was states should handle it. And so what Reagan's doing here is saying we should let states handle certain things. And he's basically appealing to a lot of those former Democrats, those white Southerners who are sort of discontented with civil rights. He's basically aiming at them and saying, if you support me and my small government, maybe we can put this hands back in the power of the states and you won't have integrated schools, that type of thing. And he's specifically going to say that kind of stuff behind the scenes. We need to appeal to these racist whites to get their votes. We have these guys are up for grabs with the Democratic Party sort of shifting gears here. Reagan's also going to run on ending the Cold War. So we've talked about, the U.S. and Vietnam, but really since JFK, the U.S. and the Soviet Union have almost been at a stalemate. The Soviets are doing their thing over here. We are going to have proxy wars in Asia and Africa, and then obviously with Cuba, but there hadn't been major gains on either side, and you sort of had both sides staring at one another with their missiles facing at one another. Reagan's going to say, we need to get done with that. If I get elected, I'm going to end the Cold War. And he's actually going to promote starting the arms race again. So we'd seen Kennedy, later Nixon, a member of his own party, call for reduction in arms, that type of thing. Reagan's going to say, no, the United States can produce better than the Soviet Union. So we just basically need to outproduce them and then defeat them militarily or economically, and we can do it. We don't need to be playing with the Soviet Union anymore. We need to end this Cold War. He's also going to be calling on, again, dramatic spending on the military. But at the same time, he's going to be calling on cutting taxes. How can you increase the size of the military, cut taxes? We'll talk about that later. But he's going to say one of the ways that we can help Americans get more money in their pocket if you have to pay the federal government less, which you can if I reduce the size of these welfare programs, that type of thing. So we'll reduce taxes. This will also encourage investment. Finally, the main thing Reagan's going to run on, and this is going to be something that is fairly new to the Republican Party. You'd seen a little bit of this when Nixon was campaigning, but Reagan is going to try to take the moral high ground when running against Jimmy Carter, and he's going to specifically appeal to Christians. He's going to say, I think the United States is losing its moral compass. We're seeing, again, gangs, serial killers, media doing all this stuff, jiggle television, all this type of thing. And he's going to say this is against the teachings of the Bible. And he's going to say, if I was elected president, I'm not going to, require Christianity or anything like that, but I am going to push the United States in the direction of being a more Christian nation. And he's going to portray himself as the sort of icon of Christianity. This is going to be interesting because he's running against Jimmy Carter, who's, again, a preacher himself, a guy who, by anybody's account, is a stand-up Christian individual, attends church every Sunday, who is, again, I don't know even his political opponents would ever fault him in morality, but he's probably the true definition as Christian as you can be, whereas Reagan, there's a lot of accounts of his early life of him doing some pretty amoral things. As a matter of fact, he was an actor, they married more than once. He got divorced, in tales of him with Hollywood starlets and that type of thing. Made propaganda films instead of World War II. But the way he sells himself is, forget that stuff. I'm the Christian guy, and I'm going to change this moral decay that's going on with the United States. So he runs on this against Carter. Carter has very little accomplishments during his administration. Very good person, but Reagan is going to be saying, I'm going to solve your problems, Americans, and I'm not going to force you to sacrifice to solve these problems. I'll get rid of the Cold War, I'll get the economy up and running, and I'll make things better. Well, this is going to be what the American public's going to want to hear, and Ronald Reagan will win an overwhelming victory over Jimmy Carter. Now, popular vote, pretty significant, almost 10%. Electoral vote, it's going to be a huge victory for Reagan. And again, you got another Republican here winning the South, except for Georgia, where Jimmy Carter is from. So Reagan is going to get into office, and we're going to talk about what he's going to do, but right as he takes over the presidency, we're going to see some of these effects from the 70s sort of hit him literally almost right when he gets into office. So Reagan gets elected, and at this point, he's going to be in charge of a Congress that's still controlled by Democrats. Democrats that are still, that are primarily these New Deal Democrats that see these social reform. The national government should be taking on these roles, whereas Reagan was elected on this idea of getting rid of this big government. So Reagan, when he gets into office, it looks like he's not going to get anything accomplished because Congress isn't going to allow him. They have very different ideas than him. Well, something's going to happen that's actually going to give Reagan some political capital. And again, this is going to happen in 1981, shortly after he takes over office. But you can, even though it's 1981, you can definitely see elements of the late 60s and 1970s in what's about to happen to Reagan. What's about to happen is this guy. So this guy's name is John Hinckley Jr., born in Oklahoma but raised in Texas, grew up in Dallas, attends Highland Park High School, goes to Texas Tech. But he, like a lot of kids in the 60s and 70s, didn't have a direction. He decides he's watching television all the time, going to movies. He decides he wants to be a Hollywood writer, moves to Hollywood, not very talented, and again, every discontented youth is moving to California, so when he gets out there, nobody wants to hire him. But while he's out there, he attends a showing of Taxi Driver, which we just recently talked about, is this movie based on this assassination or attempted assassination by Arthur Bremer of, George Wallace, a presidential candidate. While seeing Taxi Driver, John Hinckley Jr. is going to fall in love with the female star of the movie, a woman named Jodie Foster. Now, Jodie Foster, when the movie was shot, was in her mid-teens, maybe even early teens. But John Hinckley Jr. fell in love with her, and he's going to decide that he wants to get to know her. So Jodie Foster, John Hinckley Jr. sees the movie, is attending Yale. She's obviously very smart to go there. John Hinckley Jr. somehow, I don't know how you go from Texas Tech to Yale, but he's going to also apply to Yale to try to go to the same classes as Jodie Foster. He's going to start showing up in her classes and trying to get her attention. Well, she's a famous movie star. She didn't know who this guy is, and so she ignores him. John Hinckley Jr. is going to try to slip notes under her door. You know, hey, I saw you in class. All this is going to seek to do is, or all this is going to end up doing is just getting Jodie Foster to be nervous about this weird guy that started attending her classes. So she's obviously going to continue to shun John Hinckley Jr. Well, John Hinckley Jr. is going to determine that the only reason Jodie Foster doesn't like him is because she's famous and he's not. So, having seen Taxi Driver, John Hinckley Jr. is going to determine that his way to get famous is to assassinate a political candidate or a politician. Initially, he's going to consider shooting Jimmy Carter, but in the late 1970s, he starts following Jimmy Carter around, can't find something where he's not protected by a Secret Service. So when Reagan's elected, he's going to determine, I'm just going to go and shoot Reagan. Not because he disagrees with Reagan politically, but just because, hey, this will make Jodie Foster happy. So John Hinckley Jr. will determine to assassinate Reagan, and he's going to find this opportunity on March 30th, 1981. So this is only 2 months into Reagan's administration. Reagan is making a speech in D.C. to some supporters, and he's just got to walk 30 feet from this speech to his limo. Well, John Hinckley Jr. had bought a handgun, and he's sitting out here in the crowd. He's going to come out of the crowd, aim the gun at Ronald Reagan, and he's going to fire at him, I think it's 6 times, something like that. All the bullets will miss Reagan except for one, which will bounce off the bulletproof presidential limousine, go into Ronald Reagan's lung, stop inch from his heart. Secret Service men and I believe a D.C. policeman Reagan's press secretary, a guy named James Brady, will be shot in this instance. Okay, so they'll grab John Hinckley Jr. He's going to be locked up in jail. We won't talk about him. He'll be in jail until something like 2010, and then I think he might be out nowadays, or he might be on limited visitation rights. But it looks like Reagan's about to die. Instead, they're going to take him to Washington, D.C. hospital. Doctors are going to look at him, his lungs collapsing after having this bullet going through it, and they're going to tell you, Mr. President, we're going to operate on you. Ronald Reagan, supposedly, I don't know if this is true, but he's going to be able to mouth out, I hope you guys are all Republicans. Well, apparently they were, because Reagan will recover from this attempted assassination, and he will, after being out of the presidency for a couple weeks, or incapacitated for a couple weeks, he's going to return, and he's going to use this assassination as a means to get some of his reforms in place. Almost immediately after this, he's going to call on the government to cut income taxes to 23% on the on the wealthiest people. So this is going to be a significant drop from, what was it, 64 under Johnson to, I'm sorry, it's 23%. So 64, this would be down to 41% on the upper earners. And again, this is going along with his provide for the wealthy. They're going to start investing, and then it will trickle down to the people at the bottom. He's also going to get Congress to start cutting social welfare programs and some of these great society programs that Johnson had put in place. And we'll see that some people will call this the beginning of this Reagan Revolution, because and I don't know how much you have to credit this assassination for it, but this is going to get him political capital, and we'll see Reagan will use this to continue with these reforms that he'd been calling for during the 1980 election. By the way, one final thing with this, shortly after this shooting, there'll start to be this gun debate in the United States. There'd been a little bit of a gun debate before, but you'd had these assassinations. You had John F. Kennedy, you'd had MLK, Robert Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's brother, had been assassinated. You'd had attempted assassinations on Gerald Ford. Now you have this attempted assassination on Reagan. A lot of this stuff was done by handguns. Some people will use this as a rallying cry for gun reform, and we will see this become a major debate in the United States, that there needs to be some regulation, particularly of handguns and things that can be used for assassination. So again, I don't want you to give John Hinckley Jr. say he made Ronald Reagan's career, but Reagan is going to be able to use the fact that he survived the assassination for political gain. And as we'll talk about, Reagan will also use this political capital to start pressuring the Soviet Union and trying to bring an end to the Cold War.